Great. Welcome back, everyone. It's time now for our second Reach Roundtable. Once again, we've pulled together what I think is a very diverse and dynamic group of perspectives to tackle the question, what does it mean to double down on the Sustainable Development Goals? It's a true pleasure to introduce the panelists today. The founder and president of More Child Canada and More Child USA, Dr. Samantha Nutt, the Senior Vice President for Innovation at the Rockefeller Foundation, Zia Khan, the Director of Community Engagement at Elevate, Sydney Piggott. Sydney is another one of our Reach alum, and her research focused on Ethiopia's Productive Safety Net program, which is another example of some of our great work in the financial inclusion space. So I hope that we get a chance to hear a little bit about that today, Sydney. And then finally, leading our conversation is Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institution, John McArthur. John, over to you.
Thanks so much, Maren, and a delight to be with this extraordinary panel and everyone, and congratulations to Joe Wong and the whole team at U of T for this whole initiative. I think we're all pretty excited to be here, and we couldn't be more excited about the theme of doubling down on the Sustainable Development Goals. And by backdrop, Zia and I might hear a little bit more, actually have been working together on an initiative around the Sustainable Development Goals, and we actually put out a report last year on exactly this theme and thinking about how do we approach the Sustainable Development Goals in the context of many global crises, kind of metastasizing from one to the next over the past couple of years, really. And this notion of doubling down on the goals became a central theme of our work. And this came out of something that we're also thrilled that so many terrific people at U of T have been working on, this notion of 17 rooms and how do we get, I became 17 tables, I think, at U of T, but how do we get people to collaborate within and across all of these domain areas in order to take specific practical actions and key next steps to bend the curve towards success. And I've gathered that the notion of reset has been coming up a little bit over the past day of the conference. And we actually thought a lot about that word, and just to share, because as Zia and I and our colleagues went through this, we came to the conclusion that we need actually more than a reset. We will not be able to get there to where we need to go by thinking of this as pressing a button and just hit refresh. It's a little deeper than that. And we actually came up with the word transition. And we focused on 4 great transitions that we thought might be crucial to figuring out how to double down on the SDGs. And so I thought it might be useful just to explain that very quickly. The 4 great transitions that we articulated were based on what we see as emergent trends coming up in different parts of the world in different domains of expertise. And they're the following. First, a transition towards social justice for all, recoupling the economic and social perspectives that have sometimes been taken on separately. Second is a transition towards what we call a blue-green reset, with nature at the center of our approach to sustainable development, rather than something we take on at the margin or as an increment when we have time. Third is around technology, a great transition for technology and a movement away from focusing on products and to focusing on inclusive systems that are platforms for inclusion and also have the trust that societies need in order to take the new technologies forward, like vaccines. And then fourth and finally, but not certainly least of the 4, is a generational transition. There's so much evidence that past generations haven't quite cracked these problems yet. And new generations have not just a moral voice, but they have the insight and technical prowess to help figure out what success might look like. But it's not an either or, it's a partnership question. It's about intergenerational collaboration in order to make all these other transitions. And so that's how we've started to think about this. And maybe just to kick off, thought it might be interesting to hear from someone who's part of leading that transition and an alum of the REACH program, Sydney, to share her thoughts on how might we double down on this SDG agenda. Sydney, over to you.
Absolutely. I think that that's a really helpful way to kind of frame the discussion, but I'm going to start with a little bit of a critique of the SDGs because I think it's useful to point that out right away. I think that the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework is really helpful. They're calling for systemic change, which I think a lot of us have been talking about in this space and outside of this space. But ultimately, the United Nations, the membership depends on statehood. Those are the members who have actually created the systemic inequities that makes people hard to reach, right? So I think the biggest challenge for me, or what I've been working on when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals, and so many community leaders have been grappling with, is how do we actually have power within the system that is led by people or actors who have created the systemic inequities. So I think when I think about the Sustainable Development Goals, it's really about how do we rethink how we even approach these? How do we make sure that the voices of the people who are most affected, who were excluded from the creation of these Sustainable Development Goals, are actually part of the process? So a lot of the work that I did with REACH actually, and continue to do kind of as my career grows, is really focused on grounding communities into the solutions that we're creating for the Sustainable Development Goals. And my case study in Ethiopia was actually a great example of that, because decision making was actually in the hands of community members. The targeting of who would actually receive these cash and food transfers through the Productive Safety Net program were created by communities. There were councils that represented the diverse groups that were within communities who were deciding who were the recipients, and ultimately how this process would work in terms of delivery. And so that really resonated with me as I continued to kind of look at this community leadership and how that factors into really addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. And now I'm working around co-creating solutions with underrepresented communities to economic empowerment and having really inclusive economies in a meaningful way. So when I think about doubling down on the SDGs, really the main focus for me is how are we really sharing power with those who are most affected? I think that systemic change does require states, obviously, to kind of create the work to break down those barriers, but it also does require sharing power, sharing resources, and putting decision-making power into the hands of people who are most affected. I think the SDGs implementation has been a lot of consultation with those communities, but not necessarily making them the center of the actions that we want to move forward. So I think that's what I've been most interested in. And there's been some really incredible solutions. The PSNP is one example of that, but also around these South-South solutions, or working with marginalized communities within quote unquote developed countries to share knowledge directly with communities who are most affected, rather than having these intermediaries who take a lot of resources, take a lot of power, and take a lot of the voices and stories of people who are really affected by these systemic inequities. So I'm really curious to see kind of how that will move forward in terms of really creating positive change. And I think this is a great moment for it, because in the last year, people have expressed a lot of outrage around systemic inequity, and maybe people who are more apathetic towards some of the goals that are outlined in the SDGs are a little bit more woke to that now, but outrage really isn't enough. I think that learning is very important, listening to people who have been doing this work for literally centuries, and then acting is really important. So that's kind of how I approach my discussion around implementing the SDGs, but really curious to kind of hear more about what others think and how they're doing that work.
Amazing. Everyone can jump in when they want to, but maybe Sam, you've been working with a lot of marginalized communities for a long time. Anything you'd want to chime in with?
I agree wholeheartedly with everything that Sydney just said. And I guess my perspective is coming at it from the point of view of fragile, conflict-affected states. And I made this comment when we were discussing this, prior to today. But what I really question is actually the relevance of the Sustainable Development Goals when it comes to many of the communities that, for example, Warchild's dealing with throughout the world. Because even if you look at the data, the countries that are either that are least likely to achieve any measure of the Sustainable Development Goals, or who are showing negative progress towards those goals, are fragile and conflict-affected states. In fact, about 82% of them are either not on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, or there's not even enough data to be able to assess that, which is another part of the problem we see all the time when we're looking at even measuring the progress of the Sustainable Development Goals and looking at issues of equality and inequality. It's often states that are conducting those kinds of assessments and excluding even progress within refugee communities, for example, and IDP communities. So we don't even know how we're progressing. And COVID has obviously only complicated, the current pandemic has only complicated that process and made that progress that much more removed right now. So coming at it from that perspective and getting back to what Sydney was saying, I mean, I really think that when we look at fragile, so conflict and post-conflict states, we need an entire reset, rethink, reorientation on so many different fronts, both in terms of how we engage in humanitarian aid and humanitarian assistance, how we fund humanitarian aid and humanitarian assistance, how we look at models of intervention within those states to be able to support communities who are most vulnerable. And we know, I mean, and this is certainly the model that we've been following now for certainly more than 15 years. And one of the reasons why we established in the first place is that we know that it's those local community actors, local civil society organizations that have the solutions, that have the skills, that have the competencies to be able to drive change within their communities. And unfortunately, when it comes to fragile states, so many of our interventions are extremely short-sighted. And so then that becomes a double disparity that those communities have to face, because we're not investing in their capacity to respond. We're undermining their capacity to effectively respond by flooding the situation with external actors and external goods and undermining local economies. And at the same time, we're not addressing in any meaningful way the very real structural deficits around education, human rights, sexual and gender-based violence, the rights of women and girls, economic opportunity and development that would eliminate, or at the very least, reduce the likelihood of poverty and violence plaguing those communities over the long term. So that's the perspective I have, is that the Sustainable Development Goals and doubling down on those to the extent that they're even relevant or applicable in many of the environments in which we're working, we are never going to get there until we dramatically rethink what humanitarian intervention looks like and ensure that it's being driven by Southern partners, and the role of external actors, external agencies, external countries in that process is really about investing in what exists as opposed to eroding it and undermining it. And with that, I will say that in terms of like sort of practicalities, within our programs, more than 99% of the staff are local. They are either national or regional country directors and actors who are designing those programs and working with those communities. And that, frankly, is how it should be. So I think I'll leave it with that.
Very healthy provocations. Thank you so much. And Zia, I imagine these are lots of tensions you deal with professionally every day of how to support local actors, but do it from a very global view. Anything you'd want to add?
Sure. No, thanks, John and Sydney and Samantha. Those are fantastic comments. I'll just share a few perspectives on the SDGs, because I have to admit I'm a relatively recent convert to the SDGs. In my early days when they were coming up, I felt like it was another kind of like framework for discussion at various sort of high-level convenings and such, but I've seen really the promise that they can offer. And I'll make maybe just three kind of thematic points. So one is, I think the fact that there are just some goals or some indicators, period, are useful, because we can just start to learn whether we're hitting them or missing them. And I have this little cute saying around, you learn more by being specifically wrong than vaguely right. And just on that basis, if we can just measure and understand what's working or not, realizing that these goals are probably themselves off. And I think we all realize that there's going to be some big misses now, particularly after the past year. But just getting a little bit more to that precision, and precision is going to be a theme I'll come back to. So one is just the value of learning, I think, that can happen in organizing that learning. The second is, I can remember, John, and you referenced the 17 Rooms initiative that we had, and when we were launching it last year, as I was talking to a colleague of mine, they were mentioning, well, the 17 rooms I'm worried about right now are COVID, 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 and COVID. And it was really hard to talk about 2030 and all this disparate set of things when everyone was just on a single, the planet got focused on a single thing of how do we stop this pandemic. And there were sort of these interesting categories of like the immediate near-term, response that we needed. And unfortunately, we still need it in parts of the world. But now everyone's thinking about this recovery, and this recovery is the big opportunity, because this recovery will lead us to a new steady state, a new reset. And the transitions that you mentioned, John, are how we need to be thoughtful about this. So Samantha, to your point, we can recover to a state that has more resilience to it than the fragility that COVID laid bare in what was happening. And the tricky part is we're seeing a very K-shaped recovery. A good chunk of this world has recovered really, really well. I know many people here in New York City whose portfolios have done extremely well over the past year. And there's a lot of people who are not facing that. So that divergence is becoming even more important, that you were mentioning, Sydney, as well. And so when I think about how we go forward, with the SDGs, it's not only renewed attention to the goals, but just the process by which we think about the problem solving. And one, I think, is we have to get local. There's a lot of systems thinking, there isn't enough systems doing, and the doing has to happen on the ground with insights on the ground. And I think, any kind of effort or energy that can go into the problem solving versus the intellectual, thinking around these things is critical. The second is this notion of precision. We have to use data. We have to use like local voices. We just have to get way more precise, because we have to get way better about directing our resources, managing, learning, adapting, and which is, I think, the framework that the SDG provides. But the actual way we go about making progress, we have to get very, very innovative on that. So those are just some thoughts of like, I think, how I see how the SDGs are useful, but the real shift we need to make and going to solutions and doing it with much more precision.
And it's interesting just reflecting on all these great comments, because I have three sets of thoughts popping to mind. One is, I think there's often and I say this to my friends at the UN, there's often a not so helpful way that the goals are discussed. If the goals are discussed as, the UN agreed on this, therefore you have to do it, that is not helpful or actually necessarily the full story or the right story. I think and often they're referred to as a plan. Well, they're not a plan in my view. They're actually just a North Star set of reference points of where we want to get to. So if we talk about the end of extreme poverty or, building good public institutions, I don't think anyone's against that. And they're the what's. The debate has to be on the how to get there. And so that's where communities and each society has to come up with its own answers to how. And similarly, a second big bucket is the goals have been useful. And I'm a bit of a convert too, even though I've kind of lived these debates, because one of the things I've realized is they've removed a lot of the competition that used to exist between my issue versus your issue and which one's more important. And what we see is that the goals have provided a much broader way of saying, oh, what you're doing, it matters, education. What I'm doing matters, oceans. It's not an either or, it's we need both. And I actually like to canvass rooms whenever I go around. I say, what's the most important issue in the world? And it doesn't take a very big room to get 17 very different answers. And the point is they're all correct. And so how do we see this as a lingua franca, if you will, for the debates that need to happen is where I've come down on this. And then finally, I would just say, I'm actually not necessarily pessimistic in the way I sometimes emotionally am prone to be amid these crises, if you will. Like, it's easy to get down. But then there's so many things happening that are like, in Togo, they had this extraordinary revolution of digital access to use new technology to hyper-target cash transfers to very poor people. This was exactly the mobilization. It's about putting the resources in the hands of the people who need it the most. Breakthroughs that are happening because the technology's changed. And I was very involved, as some of you know, with the launch of the Millennium Development Goals, when the notion of having goals was, crazy talk. And at the time, I remember very clearly, and I actually went back later and looked at a lot of the UN documents and the memos from like 2001. And often it was said, oh, the countries with high HIV/AIDS rates will never be able to make progress on child mortality in the same way. Therefore, we shouldn't ask too much of those places. We should kind of lower expectations. Well, lo and behold, we had the antiretroviral revolution of access. We had the Global Fund, we had the US programs. Countries like Canada really got behind it. And those same countries were actually the ones that made the most progress in the next 10 years because the systems changed around what was a catastrophic failure. Kind of the best response was in the worst cases. So the stories are yet to be written on the next 10 years. But I do feel like there's a sense of agency for all of us in front of us in terms of what we can do to, try to make those next success stories in the face of what are often very tough circumstances. I don't know if others are free to disagree with that, but that's, just one way of thinking about it.
Well, John, if I could pick up on that, if you wouldn't mind, Sydney and Samantha, I'd love to, ask you a question. Both of you, at least compared to where I am at the Rockefeller Foundation, have your feet on the ground. You are solving those local problems. And I'm curious, what would be your aspiration for the SDGs, the people who think, talk, work on the SDGs, are trying to, help folks like you, now that there is a moment where people are rethinking lots of things. There's a sort of a window to redirect now. What advice might you have for people who are kind of thinking about the SDGs or trying to frame the important how question that John raised? I'd just love to sort of hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think probably Sam will agree with me on a few of these just based on our previous conversation. But I think there's two key things that I think really need to be central to this kind of decision making or actioning around the Sustainable Development Goals. I think the first one is that I think we can all agree that local actors are important and that we acknowledge that they're important, but I don't see them legitimized within the system. I think a lot of the times we're relying on these other bodies that hold kind of traditional power within a Western structure to legitimize the voices of people who are most affected. And I think that needs to go away. And communities need to be legitimized in and of themselves and have power in and of themselves so that there isn't kind of that filtering down of stories, voices, power to actually make these changes. So I think that's a big thing. And Sam spoke to this as well. A lot of that's really embedded in funding structures, right? A lot of the time it's very challenging to actually give resources directly to community bodies because it needs to be a registered institution of some kind. And that really dilutes the power that people have in order to make their own solutions. And I think the second one that we talked about a little bit was the intersectionality piece. So the Sustainable Development Goals are 17 great kind of markers for where we have to go when it comes to systems change, but people don't experience just one or two of those issues independently, right? People have so many barriers they experience at one time. And when we're talking about people who are the hardest to reach or the furthest from opportunity, those are people who are experiencing so many of these challenges at one time. And I'm even just thinking of myself. I have so many different identities that affect the way I'm perceived in this world and the way that I'm perceived in doing the work that I do. And in different spaces, those identities affect my ability to hold power in that space. But I'm also a person with a lot of privilege. So when we're really talking about the people who are hardest to reach, really understanding that their identities and their experiences are not only overlapping in terms of their barriers that they're experiencing, but also it's changing. The COVID is just a great example of how context really affects people's ability to access that kind of intergenerational change that you talked about. And so if we think about people's identities and context as dynamic and about these barriers as something that's happening all of the time to one person, it really helps to create more holistic solutions that people actually need.
I would add, I think it's always unfortunate on a panel when you've got two panelists that agree on everything. So, but I totally agree with everything that Sydney just said. And what I would add to that is I think that it is really embedded in the financial structures and what gets rewarded and how those decision-making processes take place. And we haven't broken those barriers
you might have four
down.
people who agree on that, Sam.
Oh, there you go. There you go. That's the worst kind of panel then. But I mean, that's where the rubber hits the road, honestly, and that's where it gets to be really challenging. So, there's this assumption that transparency is linked to very concrete measured outcomes. And so what that tends to do is it tends to disproportionately affect certain population groups that are more easily monitored, evaluated, tracked, and then you exclude by deliberate design a lot of refugee communities, internally displaced communities who may be more mobile, who may be fleeing conflict, for example, example, in certain environments, and where the outcome of those particular interventions, those community-based strategies, isn't guaranteed a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. So then that becomes a barrier. When you look at transformation, sometimes it's the intangible that sort of proves that the success of the effort, whether that is people's psychological advancement, whether that is their economic resilience, whether that is their sense of participation in governance, in leadership, in their community decision-making processes. But when we look at what we tend to finance, whether it's through our aid programs, whether it's through sort of UN efforts, whether it's through private individual philanthropy, it tends to be driven more by those turnkey kinds of solutions. And, you know, there was, I think it's sort of dying down now, but there was this movement within the sector where everything was focusing on innovation. It was innovation, innovation, innovation. It was per capita, a quick solution that affected the largest number of people, right? And so that tended to manifest as 3D printers for people facing, you know, who had amputated limbs and who might need a prosthetic arm, knowing full well that those inputs could not be maintained for very long in any of the countries in which they were being sent to. So there, you know, that's one example. And another example is around aid, which tends to focus on, you know, food and water and shelter and vaccinations and those very short-term interventions, but again, never meaningfully addresses the very real challenges that exist within those communities that take time. It takes time to build those resources, to build those capacities. And I'll give you a good example, a very practical example of this very, very quickly. But you know, when the COVID pandemic hit, we had been pioneering a program with the Wellspring Foundation to look at barriers to education for girls in Eastern Congo, because so many of them were being held back from school because they were in areas of high rates of sexual and gender-based violence. And so the families had concerns about allowing them to go to school because of the risk of sexual violence. And they were either keeping them at home, and they were involved in a lot of domestic labor, or being forced into early child marriage. And working with local community Congolese educators, our teams on the ground, again, local Congolese teams on the ground, developed an accelerated catch-up learning program using the very basic technology of radio. And we found within 18 months, the children in that program, predominantly girls, but obviously available to boys as well, they'd be patched in through via the basic technology of radio, a distance-based learning tied to the Congolese curriculum, classroom session. We had teaching assistants that were deployed to support the children. And after 18 months, we had higher matriculation rates at the appropriate grade level than the national Congolese sort of averages. As a result of COVID, we then worked with the Ministry of Education in Congo to ramp this up to areas where kids were again being held back from school, now not just because of the violence, but also because of the impact of the pandemic and school closures, to reach currently about 500,000 Congolese children. So again, locally driven, partnership with the Ministry of Education, and looking at the problem from a different perspective, which is not about the sort of solutions that came from outside, but that were nurtured from within. And again, it comes down to thinking about the problem, I think, very differently, being much more participatory in terms of how you approach it, thinking long-term and understanding what exists and investing in that, as opposed to developing this entire parallel infrastructure that produces impressive results very, very quickly, but that leaves very little of that architecture behind.
These are so many important points, and Zia, look, I'm sure you've thought a lot about exactly some of the technology questions that Sam was just raising, but I also just want to flag, we have about 15 minutes left and want to invite questions from the audience. One has already come in, so while I'm going to turn to you in a sec, Zia, but just to read it out, question on partnerships and Goal 17. Is it problematic, Goal 17 itself, because it positions partnership as the end game rather than a mechanism? How do we balance the need for partnership with the imperative for action, which might even tie into something you want to say there, Zia? But maybe just to talk about this technology question, because it's so foundational, I think, and the shiny thing problem, if you will, that I think Sam was referencing implicit there too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is a great question, and trusting Seth as the Senior Vice President of Innovation at the Rockefeller Foundation, something that comes up a lot in my conversations. I think there is, one thing that doesn't. I used to work in the private sector and in a lot of companies, helping them think about, kind of scaling up in value chains. And where I think we have kind of a gap in the social sector is there's a lot of energy and a lot of funding around, the new things, right? The innovation side of things. Where there is a missing gap is the scaling. And then there is ultimately, is government going to pick this up or is the markets going to pick this up, right? Those are the end game for what scales. I'm encouraged by some funder collaboratives that have emerged, like Co-Impact, like Blue Meridian, like Audacious, where funders are trying to pool their funds into proven solutions to address that middle area. And the McArthur Foundation, does a wonderful job with their 1,000 and change, where Roseanne Haggerty, who was the recent winner with Community Solutions, has been working and innovating. We partner with her, on that, and now, to receive that big award. There's just not enough, I think, of that happening, right? And I think that is there's enough sort of proof points. And now we need to sort of do that kind of long effort that you described, where you're not just generating the near term, kind of benefits, what I might refer to, again, just using some a private sector metaphor, the income statement. You have to build the balance sheet. You have to build the assets, the capacities, which are harder to measure. And so I feel like if we could solve that problem a little bit of what I think is a big market failure of there's great need, yet not enough supply, in that middle zone of its proven innovations, and we've sort of cleared that market, but it's not quite ready for government to pick it up because government has, can't afford to fail in too many situations, or they have headlines they have to deal with, for a while. I'm not saying that's the only answer, but that would be like one thing to pay attention to. And I wonder if the SDGs could provide a framework of that, of as we think about solutions, across all these 17 rooms, how might we play in that scaling area a little bit more and direct resources there?
Can I add to that, Zia? I 100% agree, and I think part of that is also helping funders, particularly some of the institutional donors, to rethink the length of time that they have for their funding cycles. And we know for a lot of governments, it's very short term. It's 6 months, 1 year, maximum often 3 years. But really, we all know that we're talking about generational change here, which at a minimum is 5 to 10 years. And I think it's helping to have a longer runway that better manages those expectations. And again, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. It's finding the right balance within that. And to your point, there is, a strong role for innovation within that. But when it comes at the expense of some of the longer term structural challenges, then we just continue to pile, failed solutions on top of one another and expecting different outcomes. So I think that is part of the challenge, is helping institutional donors and others to different efforts understand that you need a longer runway if you're going to be truly participatory in that environment.
And maybe I would just add from my side, I think there's, and when we're talking about the SDGs writ large, there's so many of these important issues that have come up around donor funding, aid funding, global systems and architecture, all these hot buttons about how to get the hands of the people, the resources in the hands of the people who can use it best. There's a huge set of questions here about so-called advanced economies, Canada itself, what it does on these issues. And here I do think I've been pleasantly surprised by the extent to which, in some ways, the SDGs have been helpful for invigorating a new national conversation on poverty. So Canada didn't even have a poverty line till a couple of years ago. And there's been a huge push that's actually led to this first time in a long time major decline in child poverty. And lots of debates on exactly how, but there's probably a mix of high-level government policy and bottom-up community action. And so one of the things we're seeing, I think, is an opportunity for so-called reverse technology transfer, if you will. So a lot of these system innovations that have come up in the past generation on how international actors collaborate can actually be applied at home too. And I was talking, if we look at an issue that is kind of an unsolved problem, like child obesity and overweight, this is a massive problem across all countries. It's an epidemic, roughly speaking, everywhere. And we don't know exactly what the solutions are. It's not simply diet. It's not simply, urban planning. It's not simply, curriculum. It's all of the above. And so we need multi-pronged approaches where we look, in my view, at outcomes, but have different communities learn around what type of innovations might work if they're all looking at the same benchmarks. I was in Ottawa a little while ago, and I mentioned that to a senior, civil servant, and they said, that sounds like what we did with the international innovation-based finance, where we did outcome-based financing to support community-based things that work. And I said, that's right. And so this notion of how we can use these goals, again, as a common reference point for unsolved problems, I think is under-leveraged. But that's very different from, say, a COVID vaccine access question right now, which is literally how do you get the resources and the systems in place so that there's universal access immediately, where we kind of know what the technology is, but our problem is access. So I think we have to segment these types of problems too and make sure that we're not always thinking over there when we also need to be thinking over here. We're just seeing, I'm sorry, I'm just seeing new questions coming in. Please chime in, but the concept of trust came up earlier this morning in a conversation with Marla and Peter, just to read it out. In particular, the need to regain trust and perhaps even establish a new model of trust between sectors in order to double down. What would a new model look like and how do we achieve it? I think this notion of trust is quite interesting because I think also some of the comments coming up reflect a lack of trust in a lot of systems, and that's part of why we need to think afresh about how to rebuild trust in order, it's not just technical, it's human in terms of how people value each other and moving forward. Any thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts on trust, and I don't know if this will really help around the practical examples, but I noticed that this is something that comes up frequently around the concept of trust itself. And I was actually taking a course at Cambridge last year or the year before, where someone was saying, like, that's the foundation of kind of making these partnerships work, back to the other question. And it's really interesting because I think for a lot of communities that are marginalized within these systems, we're so used to just operating without trust. Like, we're so used to just having to work with people who we don't trust or actors that we don't trust in order to survive, right? Because so many of the things that have happened in the past historically have caused us to be like, of course, we're not going to trust these people. They, enslaved my ancestors, or they stole all of our land, or they trafficked us across oceans. Like, these are not things that breed trust, to say the least. And they've been happening for 600 years. So it's very hard to kind of even talk about a system of trust when it comes to kind of working with partners in certain levels. So, I think in the context of Canada, for example, Indigenous communities working with the government, how do we really expect that to happen? How do we really expect, reconciliation to really happen when trust has been broken down for so long and continues to be broken down, right? It's not something that ended at any point. So I think it's a really interesting way to think about things and whether it's even possible to build that in the short term. And my feeling is no. I think that when you've had so many generations that have had that trust breakdown with these actors, it's very challenging to kind of come up with that again. But I think what's really interesting, and the example of Canada is one of them, South Africa is another one very similar, is the people often talk about the reconciliation piece, but not about the truth piece. And I know that's something that also, my roots are in the Caribbean, something that we also talk about a lot when it comes to reparations and other conversations around working with these actors. So I think that trust is important, but the first part is really acknowledging and unpacking what has caused this distrust. And I think that any type of rebuilding of a new model can't start with the trust building piece. It has to start with the truth piece, with the unpacking. Why does this exist for communities who are furthest from opportunity? And then kind of co-creating what that looks like going forward. So I think it's a long process, and I think I definitely won't see it in my lifetime, but I'm really curious to see how people can just take a step back and acknowledge why the distrust exists and then build from there, rather than kind of clean slating things, because I think that that's not realistic, especially for communities that are kind of really the furthest to reach or really the most oppressed in these systems.
If I could jump in, I have a couple of observations on trust. So a big part of the Rockefeller Foundation's work is oriented around how can we, as we come into a recovery mode, from COVID, think about a green and inclusive recovery. And we have sort of two big areas that we're leaning into. One is around making sure that everyone in the world has access to energy, electricity. Realizing in the States here, even, the broadband access was such a huge issue, which is related to that, but there's 1 billion people in the world who don't have access to electricity. Now that's just a modern need. And it's very interesting taking a big, we are taking, Samantha, a long-term approach to this on systems change, and committed quite a bit of our resources over multiple years to it. And it's very interesting to look at the system of how national governments, investors, entrepreneurs, local communities, women in those local communities, and all the moments of distrust that happen in that system. And how can we convene the right groups of people and kind of create bridges over those distrusts, where an investor might say, well, if I give money to this national government for a plan, like 20% of it's going to disappear, or and what might be the mechanisms to overcome that. But I'm reminded of, I don't know if you're familiar with this group called StoryCorps, but they just sort of capture stories. And the founder of StoryCorps said something like, it's hard to distrust someone when you know their story. And I'm just really compelled by this notion of how can we just share stories of different people working on these. And in one way, working on these systems problems allows people to share stories of, each element, and it can help address those dysfunctions. The second area that we're really leaning into is on the pandemic. How do we create, an institute, a warning system, a response system, so that we don't have to face this again? And what's interesting there, if I reflect on the past year, was in many ways, experts didn't trust people to make the right calls. We just closed beaches. We just told people 6 feet apart. We didn't really equip them with, well, this is how COVID spreads in a room. And so make your judgment calls on how to keep yourself safe. And I think there's going to have to be a big evolution of trusting people to solve their own problems, and equipping them not only with the financial resources, but the knowledge, and trusting them to use that knowledge to go that final mile, because I just don't think that we're going to be able to do this in an expert-driven model going forward. Those are just sort of two observations on trust that I had that were sparked by your comments, Sydney.
I'll pick up on that as well, Zia, if that's okay. I wholeheartedly agree. And my experience, certainly trust comes from a couple of things, but one is active listening. And you mentioned that, it's the shared stories, and through that active listening, shedding some of the paternalisms that are often embedded in the architecture, particularly of humanitarian assistance. So coming at it from the perspective of how can we do something together, and what do you need from me, as opposed to here's what I'm going to do for you. And that reframing needs to happen, I think, frankly, very, very urgently within the humanitarian sector, even for it to not only be effective, but to maintain its legitimacy at this moment in history, frankly, that's sort of my perspective there. And then the second one, from my experience, really comes down to consistency. You build trust by being present for a longer period of time, by doing exactly what you said you were going to do, and doing it in a respectful and inclusive way. So it does take time to build that trust, especially with communities that have been mistreated or neglected or maligned in the past. You really have to you have to sort of approach it from the perspective of here's how we would like this relationship to evolve, and then be very consistent about that, and be very purposeful, and be very present around that. And then if you do that, it takes time, but I found that to be the most effective.
So foundational. And I'm just maybe zooming out for a moment, and we have a question I want to make sure we hear from everyone. SDG 16 became a catch-all. We're going to go 5 minutes over, by the way. I think we have a little bit extra time here just to share with the audience. But SDG 16 became a catch-all for worthy actions that didn't lobby strongly for one of their own. And SDG 16, for those who don't know, is very salient for this. It's around peace, justice, and public institutions, really. It's, in retrospect, if you think of the world today, it's amazing that we even have SDG 16, because imagine like 193 countries today agreeing on what they would aspire to public institution-wise, let alone what they did 6 years ago. But should we concentrate on adding some of the items there explicitly into other SDGs, where, as some of the panelists have suggested, more traction is needed? Maybe just to add a quick thought on this as well, on this notion of trust and even the theme of the conference. I was struck, you mentioned, Sydney, the Indigenous people of Canada, and that's obviously a long-term catastrophe, the relationship between a couple of years ago, the Assembly of First Nations and Indigenous Services Canada actually agreed on a new fiscal framework with the SDGs as a neutral benchmark for the financial allocations and measuring success. And I think it was interesting because it wasn't my goals versus your goals, it was a neutral reference point in the middle that had, of course, been agreed under a conservative government, pursued under a liberal government. And there's an opportunity in these things, and I'm not up to speed on the latest and how that's gone. I need to catch up. But the point being, some of these goals, if used right as devices for refresh of conversations, can help foster new dynamics of trust where trust is broken. And so part of, I think, what we're talking about here ultimately in gaining trust is also showing results. And this is why my colleague Homie and I, and Homie Cross, I know, was involved in the program yesterday, we worked on this issue of leave no one behind and how to translate that from a slogan to a nice tagline to actually something real. What does it mean to actually leave no one behind? And I've said, we need to rename the SDGs the specific development goals. This is about specific people facing specific problems in specific places. And exactly as you said, Sydney, often specific people facing many problems in specific places. And if we can't address those specifics to support people on the specific challenges they're facing, the goals aren't delivering on their promise by any measure. So I think that there is an element in which results can beget trust, can beget fresh thinking, can beget maybe harder problems to be taken on. But we have a couple minutes left. Anyone else want to contradict that or argue or take anything in a different direction?
I don't want to argue, but I'd like to add to that around SDG 16 in particular, it's about reducing violent deaths. And unfortunately, with the pandemic, we've actually seen an increase in violence, especially violence towards women and girls. And even within, like if you look at that IRC report, and I actually have the stat here, about 41% of the fragile and conflict affected states, the rate of violent deaths is increasing. So I think that we can't even really talk about achieving SDG 16 unless we also are talking about arms control, gun control in various countries, but also the international shipment of arms, particularly to vulnerable states and to actors that are waging war. It's and that's something that we have to really address. You've got a lot of wealthy countries that are still actively profiteering from the arms trade, both licit and illicit, and we can't talk about reducing violent deaths unless we're willing to engage in that particular subject.
Just as one quick point of fact, that's obviously the first target. The SDG 16 is broader than that too, which is part of why if it gets into rule of law, a lot of the broader issues around even corruption, bribery, accountability of institutions. So that's certainly one of the headline issues, but part of, I think, the challenge is what goes in and what goes out. And that's, SDG 16 was a response to the lack of discussion on institutions under the MDGs. How can you do this if you don't have good institutions that are fair? And so this becomes, and as my colleague Sarah Mendelson has said, at Carnegie Mellon, who was, senior US ambassador on these human rights issues, you can't talk about SDG 16 abroad if you're an American diplomat now without talking about it at home. Because of the institutional failures at home. And I think, Canada is, as a Canadian, I think Canada's got a lot of similar issues to think through as well. Sydney, you're trying to jump in, I think.
Yeah, I think, and this is maybe kind of going back to my initial comments, I think that the SDGs, and Zia really pointed this out well, is really helpful as a framework for understanding and measuring these systemic inequities that exist globally. But I don't think that we need to be too concerned with how, if each metric is under each SDG, because that intersectionality piece is important. We can't be tackling them in silos. They need to be tackled all together. And that doesn't necessarily mean one kind of actor needs to tackle all of them, but that partnerships piece that was, you know, the last goal kind of speaks to the fact that if everyone's working to their strengths and understanding the way that these issues interrelate, then there's a great way to be able to kind of work, you know, stay in your lane, but at the same time be able to support people in different ways that they're affected by these inequities. So I think that's kind of my way of thinking about all of these goals, because I think there are shortcomings, of course, but having a framework where we can actually measure where we need to go in order to make a big difference or shift the needle in a major way is helpful. And I think, you know, I'm a little bit pessimistic when it comes to the SDGs, like the same way the MDGs, like I don't think that any of these goals will be achieved in a meaningful way by 2030. Like, just straight up, I don't believe it. I would love to see it happen, but I don't necessarily think that that's the most important piece. I think exactly like we've talked about, what is really important is having a framework for understanding these inequities, having action plans for how we're going to overcome them, and then having the metrics for actually measuring when we've reached success, right? And I don't necessarily think that the timeline of them or the time crunch of them is the most important as much as the ways that we get there. So I think that that's kind of the way that I think of SDG 16, but also of all of the SDGs is really, if we put too much weight on like, these are the markers that we need to achieve by 2030, it will be very discouraging for so many actors. And I don't know how much work will actually get done. But if we think of something like we said, that this is generational change and this will be built up over multiple decades, possibly even centuries before, if we have centuries, because, you know, climate change is not really giving us that much time. But if we continue to work towards these in a collaborative way and in a way that really shares power and resources among all the different actors that are affected, I think that, you know, that's what the value of the SDGs are, more than actually thinking like we're going to reach gender equity in 2030, because, you know, at this rate, we likely will not. So I think that that's a better way maybe to think about the Sustainable Development Goals, rather than saying like, we want to meet these targets by 2030.
You know, and if I could just jump in, there's a puzzle, or at least I've been puzzling over it. Maybe there's a lot smarter people who've got this figured out. But I think one of the big tensions when you look at the SDGs and people who are looking at the systems changes, they're working on big institutions or big public policies that by definition are somewhat homogenous. You know, I'll just use as an example, a $15 minimum wage. You know, there's a big debate around that. It will be one number that covers a lot of territory. Yet what $15 means here in the United States in one region is very different than what it means in another region. And if what we're really aiming for is like a living wage or equity, that by nature means there must be some variation there. I think the same case is of lots of institutions when you talk about justice, when you talk about governance. So we have this tension between, you know, we need these institutions and these public goods to almost by definition be at a level of a common denominator and work for a wide range of things. Yet I think what we're really learning is on the ground, everything is in context and localized. So I think the big challenge going forward is how can we make public institutions that can get much more precise and tailored in how they support the activities on the ground and the problem solving on the ground. I don't want to just default to the idea that like digital infrastructure or like digital opportunities will help with that. But I think that is an opportunity for refresh thinking, because a lot of the way we think about public institutions and public goods is hundreds of years old. And now might be a window to rethink that so we can be much more targeted and effective with our problem solving, and much more targeted and effective with moving the resources that these public goods and public institutions are meant to drive.
Sam, we have to draw this to a close, but you want to bring us home?
I wanted to just say what a terrific opportunity it was, and to meet all of you and to discuss these issues with you. And I know we haven't solved them today, but at least I hope we've given people something to think about. And I look forward to doing this again sometime.
Amazing. Well, I would just say, I think Sydney's challenge on, you know, how these goals are useful or not is crucial. And just as a researcher, you know, I even looked at the Millennium Development Goals and where we could see things changed and they didn't. And, you know, bottom line is, compared to pre-goal trajectories, at least 20 million, if not 30 million more people were alive at the end of 2015 than if the business as usual had continued. Other access to water didn't get the same type of success, sanitation and so forth. So understanding what the difference was, how it mattered, even if the goals weren't achieved, 20 million more people survived, that is a big deal. So I think we have to think about how these goals are tools to do real work, to make real progress, to take on the actual challenges that people have in front of us. And I couldn't be more honored to be with three amazing people who are taking those challenges on in such important parts of the world and the society we're all living in. So thank you. What an extraordinary group to be part of. And with that, hand it back to our organizers and to Maren.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much to our roundtable guests. Such a great discussion. There's been so many ideas building on themes from earlier in the symposium. So things that I think I'm seeing reemerge are the idea of trust, this idea of character and character-driven leadership and the moral imperative and systems change. And I think so many of these ideas are actually going to carry so well into this next conversation. So in particular, stories and centering community voices in our actions. Before we jump into this next session, though, we'll share our final case study with you all. And this is a case study about a digital fabrication laboratory in Mexico. Let's take a look.